It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. No work, no people, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and a small cabin I'd rented for 3 nights. I found it listed on some backwoods rental site. Nothing fancy, just a basic wooden structure with a bed, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. That was all I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking low behind the thick wall of trees surrounding the place. The dirt road leading to the cabin had been rough, full of potholes and branches scraping against my truck. I wasn't even sure I was on the right path until I saw the small wooden sign nailed to a tree. Private property, no trespassing. Beneath it, a smaller sign had the cabin's name, Hunter's Rest. That was the place. The cabin itself was simple, made of old, weathered wood, but sturdy. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and I hadn't seen another house for miles on the drive-in. Perfect. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The air inside was musty, like old wood and damp earth. I dropped my bag on the bed and took a quick look around. The kitchen had a small gas stove, a single basin sink, and an old refrigerator that rattled when it kicked on. The bathroom was cramped, just a toilet and a rust-stained sink, but it would do. The main room had a fireplace, a wooden table, and 1 chair. Basic, but comfortable. I unpacked quickly, putting my few supplies on the counter. A couple of canned goods, some instant coffee, a loaf of bread, and a 6-pack of beer. I wasn't planning on cooking anything fancy. After setting my things down, I stepped outside to get some air. The forest was silent, the kind of silence you only hear when you're deep in the woods. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the far-off hoot of an owl. I decided to chop some wood before it got too dark. There was a rusted axe leaning against the cabin's outer wall, its handle worn from years of use. A small pile of logs sat nearby, just enough to last a night or two. As I lifted the axe, a strange feeling crawled up my spine, like I was being watched. I turned, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching long in the fading light. Shrugging off the feeling, I got to work, splitting logs and stacking them by the cabin door. By the time I finished, the sky was darkening, a deep purple fading to black. I headed inside, lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, and sat back in the chair with a beer. The warmth of the flames and the quiet made me feel at ease, but that unease from earlier hadn't fully faded. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. I wasn't used to being this far from civilization. I turned in early, lying on the lumpy mattress and listening to the wind outside. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, something outside, a soft crunch, like footsteps on dried leaves. My body tensed, probably an animal. The woods were full of them, after all. Still, I stayed awake for a while, listening, but whatever it was didn't make another sound. The next morning, I stepped outside, stretching in the crisp air. The forest looked peaceful, untouched. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees toward the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked in that direction. They were deep, like someone heavy had been standing there, just at the edge of the clearing. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Maybe a hunter passing through? That had to be it. Still, I felt uneasy, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off and decided to take a short hike to clear my head. The woods were dense, but the rental listing had mentioned an old trail behind the cabin. I found it easily, a narrow path winding through the trees. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About half a mile in, I found something strange. A small wooden shack, almost hidden by the undergrowth. It was old, the wood warped and rotting, the door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Inside, there was an old metal cot with a stained mattress, a rusted lantern, and something that made my skin crawl. An old, cracked mirror hanging on the wall, covered in deep scratches. I didn't stay long. I turned and headed back toward the cabin, walking faster than before. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following me. But every time I turned, the path was empty. Back at the cabin, I locked the door. I wasn't usually the paranoid type, but something about that shack, those footprints, it didn't feel right. I spent the rest of the day inside, only stepping out to grab more firewood. As night fell, the forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in closer. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. Slow, deliberate steps outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold, soft knocking on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking came again, louder this time. I reached for the axe I'd brought inside earlier, gripping it tight. Whoever was out there wasn't an animal. They were waiting, listening. Then the doorknob rattled. That was it. I jumped out of bed, flicked on the lights, and yelled, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, footsteps retreating, slow and steady, back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me go. But there was nothing. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I didn't report it. What would I even say? No one would believe me, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know, without a doubt, I wasn't alone out there. I'll never go back. I never wanted to come out here. The cabin was my brother's idea. He said I needed a break, that getting away from everything would clear my head. I didn't argue because arguing would have been more exhausting than just going along with it. So, I packed a bag, filled the tank, and started driving. The place was tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The roads were rough, just dirt and gravel, and they got worse the closer I got. Trees pressed in on both sides, thick and tall, blocking out the sky. Felt like I was driving into a tunnel with no end. The cabin itself was small, just one story, with a slanted roof and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. It looked old but sturdy, built from thick logs, the kind that had seen years of harsh winters. My brother had stayed here before. He swore it was peaceful. Inside, it was just as simple as I expected. A single room with a small kitchen area, a table, and a couch that looked about as comfortable as a pile of rocks. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. No TV, no radio, just the quiet hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the wooden beams settling. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the small wood stove, made a sandwich, and read a book by lantern light. My phone had no service, which was expected. My brother had warned me. Still, it was strange, knowing I was completely disconnected. No way to call anyone, no way to check the time unless I looked at the old clock on the wall. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but the sound didn't stop. It got closer, slow, deliberate steps on the dried leaves and twigs just beyond the porch. I held my breath and listened. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room in darkness. My eyes adjusted, picking up the faint outline of the furniture. The noise outside stopped, but I kept listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was being paranoid. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The air was cold, crisp. The ground was covered in frost. I looked around the cabin, scanning the trees, the narrow dirt path that led back to the main road. Nothing seemed out of place. I convinced myself I had overreacted. By the third day, I started to feel a little more settled. I chopped some wood, took a short walk, tried to enjoy the quiet, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It made no sense. I was alone. I should have felt relaxed, but instead, I felt exposed, like someone was standing just out of sight, just beyond the trees. That night, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer. Heavy footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The air was so still I could hear my own breathing. Then 3 slow knocks on the front door. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A ranger? But what kind of person wanders through the woods at this hour? I grabbed the small hunting knife I had brought with me and moved as quietly as possible toward the door. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't make a sound. The knocking didn't come again. After a few minutes, I worked up the nerve to peek through the small window beside the door. My breath fogged up the glass. I wiped it away with my sleeve and looked out. Nothing, just darkness and trees. But the feeling didn't go away. I knew someone had been there. I stood by the door, listening, waiting. Eventually, I crawled back into bed. But I didn't sleep. Morning came slow. I checked the porch as soon as the sun was up. There were footprints, large ones, not boots, bare feet. The prints led from the treeline to the door, then back again. I packed my things, fast. My brother had said the cabin was safe, that I'd be fine, but he didn't see this. He didn't hear it. I grabbed my keys and yanked open the door, ready to leave. Something was sitting on the porch, a small bundle of sticks, carefully arranged in the shape of a person. I didn't stop to think. I ran to my truck, threw my bag inside, and started the engine. My hands were shaking. I backed out onto the narrow road, gravel crunching under the tires, and didn't look back. I drove straight home. My brother asked me what happened, but I didn't have the words to explain it. I still don't. I just know I won't be going back. A week later, my brother sent me a picture. He had gone to the cabin to check things out. He found another bundle of sticks on the porch. This one was bigger. I didn't respond. I didn't want to know more. Some places you just don't go back to. The wind had started picking up by the time I reached the cabin. The drive had been long, longer than I expected, with winding roads that seemed to stretch endlessly through the thick woods. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway as I pulled up. The cabin was smaller than I had pictured from the listing, with dark wooden walls and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. Still, it was secluded, and that was what I needed. I had rented it for a week, just me alone. I needed the break. Work had been draining, and the city felt suffocating lately. Too many people, too much noise. Out here, there was nothing but the trees, the cold air, and silence. The place smelled like old wood and dust when I stepped inside. The furniture was simple. A worn couch, a small wooden dining table, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. There was no TV, no internet, just a radio sitting on the counter. I liked that. It made me feel disconnected in a good way. I put my bag down in the bedroom, a small space with a single bed pushed against the wall. The mattress felt stiff when I sat down, but I didn't care. I wasn't here for luxury. By the time I finished unloading my supplies, mostly canned food, water, and a few essentials, it was pitch black outside. I stepped onto the porch and lit a cigarette, staring into the dark forest beyond. The trees swayed, making the branches creak and groan. It was peaceful. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I sat up, I heard it again, a dull, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't close, but it was steady. I checked my phone. No service. I listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It almost sounded like it was coming from the woods. I shook it off. Probably a branch knocking against something. Maybe an animal. I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I pulled the blanket over my head and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange outside. Near the edge of the trees, there were footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too large, too wide. Someone had been here. The weirdest part was the way they were spaced. The prints weren't scattered like someone had been walking normally. They were far apart, like whoever made them had been running or jumping. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No cabins nearby, no campsites, nothing. Just miles of trees in every direction. Maybe a hunter? But why would they be out here in the middle of the night? I spent most of the day trying to shake the uneasy feeling. I went for a short walk, staying close to the cabin, but I kept feeling like something was off. The woods felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling, just dead silence. That night, I locked the door. I wasn't scared, not really, but I wasn't about to take any chances. The tapping sound started up again, a little closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I tried to sleep, but it took hours before exhaustion finally pulled me under. I woke up to the tapping again. It was right outside the window. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. The tapping was slow, steady, like someone was knocking lightly against the glass. I didn't move. I listened, then silence. I reached for the flashlight and turned it on, aiming it toward the window. Nothing, just the reflection of my own face staring back at me. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I found something else. Near the footprints from the day before, there were new marks. Not footprints, but long, deep scratches in the dirt, like something had been dragged. I was done. I packed my stuff, threw it into my car, and got ready to leave. But as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. What if whatever was out there was still watching? I forced myself to push that thought away and got into the car. The engine roared to life, and I wasted no time peeling out of the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. Tall, still, watching. I didn't slow down. I never believed in the idea of a place being inherently bad. Evil wasn't a thing that clung to wood and stone. At least that's what I thought before the trip. This was supposed to be a getaway. A simple, quiet weekend in the mountains to clear my head. Work had been stressful. Life had been dragging me down, and I just wanted some time away from everything. No phone, no emails, no city noise. Just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. I booked the place online. It was an old hunting cabin up in the hills of western Montana, about 10 miles from the nearest town. The pictures made it look rustic but comfortable. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a small front porch overlooking the trees. There was a creek nearby, and the description promised complete solitude. That's what I needed, just a weekend to myself. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the tree line. The drive up had been rough, miles of uneven dirt roads, winding through thick forest. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe a little more worn down, but still standing strong. I got out, stretched my legs, and took in the silence. No cars, no people, just the wind moving through the trees. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a single main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a door leading to a bedroom in the back. It was basic but fine. I dropped my bag, checked my phone. No signal, as expected, and went about settling in. The sun was gone by the time I finished unpacking. The only light came from the few dim bulbs powered by a generator, and the fireplace I started for warmth. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The cabin made noises, more than I expected. Wood creaked, the wind knocked branches against the roof, and at one point, I thought I heard something moving outside. Probably an animal, I told myself. Just the woods settling around me. But I kept waking up, each time feeling like something wasn't quite right, like I wasn't alone. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the sun rise over the treetops. The air was crisp, the forest alive with birds and rustling leaves. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. I spent the day hiking, exploring the area around the cabin. I followed the creek for a while, then climbed a small ridge to get a better view. From up there, I could see how deep the forest stretched. Miles and miles of trees, no signs of other people. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already getting low. That feeling of unease returned as soon as I stepped inside. The air felt heavier, like the place had been waiting for me. I shook it off, made some dinner, and tried to relax by the fire. Then, just as I was starting to feel comfortable, I heard something outside. It was soft at first, barely noticeable over the crackling fire. A sound like slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the leaves. I sat up, listening. The steps stopped. I waited, heart pounding, but I didn't hear anything else. Probably just a deer, I told myself again. But when I went to check the front porch, the air outside felt different. Still, too still. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I shined my flashlight into the trees but saw nothing. I stood there for a minute, listening, before convincing myself I was overreacting. That night was worse than the first. I kept waking up, heart racing, convinced I had heard something moving inside the cabin. But every time I sat up, the room was empty. The walls groaned, the wind howled, but nothing was there. I barely slept. The next day, I thought about leaving early, but I had driven all the way out here, and part of me refused to give in to whatever fear was creeping up my spine. I spent the morning chopping firewood, trying to keep my mind busy. But as I worked, I kept getting the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, the trees seemed different, like something had moved just out of sight. Then I found the tracks. They were just outside the tree line, leading from the creek toward the cabin. Bare footprints, human but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too high, like something had been walking on the very tips of its feet. They weren't there yesterday, and they led straight to my porch before turning back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then, without thinking, I looked up. The trees were still. No movement, no wind, just silence. I decided then and there that I was leaving. I packed up as fast as I could, throwing my things into my bag, barely taking the time to zip it up. As I stepped onto the porch, I glanced toward the tree line one last time, and that's when I saw it. A shape standing just beyond the trees. Tall, too tall, with limbs that looked stretched like it had been pulled out of shape. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see its face. I didn't want to. I turned, ran to my truck, and drove. Didn't look back, didn't stop until I hit the main road. My heart didn't stop pounding until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people. I never told anyone about what happened. Never reported it, never tried to find out more about that cabin. I don't want to know. Whatever was out there, it wasn't meant to be found. And I wasn't supposed to see it. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. It was supposed to be a quiet trip. I needed some time away, and my uncle's old hunting cabin in Montana seemed like the perfect place. The cabin had been sitting empty for years after he passed, but it was still in decent shape, at least according to my cousin, who had been there last summer. The drive up was long, over winding roads that got narrower and more uneven the farther I went. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest town, with no cell service after I turned onto the last stretch of dirt road. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I remembered. Just a single room with a loft for sleeping, a fireplace, and a small kitchen area. There was an old generator out back, a woodpile stacked up against the side, and an outhouse a little ways into the trees. The windows were covered in dust, and the whole place smelled like wood and old fabric. I spent the first hour sweeping out cobwebs, bringing in firewood, and checking the cabinets. There was some canned food, probably years old, but it looked fine. I had brought enough supplies anyway, so I wasn't too worried. The generator groaned when I cranked it, but it eventually came to life, giving me just enough power to keep the lights on for a few hours at night. The first night was uneventful. I made some dinner on the old propane stove, had a couple of beers, and sat outside listening to the forest settle into nighttime. It was peaceful, but there was something about the silence that made me uneasy. It wasn't the usual quiet of being alone. It felt heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I slept upstairs in the loft, wrapped in an old sleeping bag on the cot. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the walls and making the trees creak. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I sat up, my heart hammering, and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving along the side of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, careful to move quietly, and pointed it out the nearest window. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or something smaller, but my gut told me otherwise. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. There were tracks in the dirt, boot prints. They circled the cabin once and stopped near the back door. No signs of entry, nothing taken or disturbed. But someone had been here, walking around in the middle of the night. I spent the day cutting firewood and keeping busy. I wanted to push the unease away, convince myself that maybe the tracks had been there before I arrived and I just hadn't noticed. But the thought lingered, gnawing at me. That night, I locked the door and made sure the shotgun my uncle had left behind was loaded and within reach. I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me, but I wasn't stupid either. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. Around midnight, the sounds started. Not footsteps this time, tapping, light, almost rhythmic, against the front window. I lay frozen in the loft, gripping the shotgun, my ears straining. The tapping stopped. Then, a few seconds later, it came again. It wasn't the wind. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight and aimed it toward the window. The second the light hit the glass, the tapping stopped. I didn't see anything, just my own reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. Whatever was out there, whoever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things, making sure to keep the shotgun close, and stepped outside. That's when I saw it. The door to the outhouse was open. I knew for a fact I had shut it the day before. I stood there, staring at it, debating whether to check inside or just get in my truck and go. My gut told me to leave it alone, but I needed to see. I walked up slowly, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, scratched into the wood of the back wall, were 3 words: "Leave, now, run." Asterisk, asterisk. The scratches were fresh. I didn't hesitate. I turned, sprinted back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, and threw everything into the truck. The tires spun in the dirt as I floored it down the road, my hands shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel steady. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Only then did I pull over, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there for a long time, staring at the road ahead, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never went back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But I know one thing. Someone had been watching me, waiting, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I never liked being alone in the woods. Something about the silence, the endless stretch of trees, and the way the wind moved through them always made me uneasy. But after the last few months, I needed a break from everything. Work had been hell, my girlfriend had left, and I just needed to clear my head. My friend Mike told me about a cabin his uncle owned out in Montana. Said it was empty most of the year, had no phone service, and was miles away from anyone. It sounded perfect. I got there in early November, just as the cold was settling in. The drive was long hours of winding roads and thick forest. The last 30 miles were just dirt paths, barely wide enough for my truck. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just a simple A-frame with a porch and a woodpile stacked against the side. The inside was basic, 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio and a few old books. I spent the first day chopping wood, making sure I had enough to last. Nights were getting cold, and I didn't want to be stuck without heat. As the sun started setting, I made some canned chili on the propane stove and sat outside with a beer. The quiet was nice. No cars, no voices, just the sound of wind in the trees. But after a while, I started to feel something I couldn't shake. It was that feeling of being watched, like someone was standing just beyond the tree line. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I went inside anyway, locking the door behind me. The first night was fine. I slept hard, exhausted from the drive and the work. The second night was when things started feeling off. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something outside. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer sound like, what coyotes sound like. This was footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the frost-covered leaves. I lay there, completely still, listening. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. Just silence after that. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. The next morning, I went outside to check. No tracks. The ground was frozen solid, but still, I knew what I had heard. I tried to shake it off, but that feeling of being watched stayed with me all day. I spent the daylight hours keeping busy, chopping more wood, checking the propane levels, making sure I had enough food. But as soon as the sun started setting, that unease crept back in. That night, I locked every door and window before climbing into bed. I barely slept. Every little sound made my muscles tense. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was closer, a soft thud against the cabin wall. Then another, like someone was tapping, testing. I sat up, heart pounding. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept by the bed, my only real weapon. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched out for what felt like hours before I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. My woodpile had been moved, not just knocked over, but rearranged. Some pieces stacked neatly, others scattered, like someone had been playing with it. I stood there, staring at it, my breath fogging in the cold air. I checked around the cabin, looking for footprints, but again, nothing. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to pack up and get the hell out. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe an animal had messed with the wood. Maybe the footsteps were just trees creaking in the wind. I tried to push the fear down, keep my mind occupied. I hiked a few miles, tried to clear my head. By the time I got back, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. That night was worse, much worse. I had just gotten into bed when I heard it. A long, slow creak, like weight pressing down on wood. The porch. Someone was on the porch. My stomach clenched. I barely breathed. Then a soft rattle. The doorknob turned slightly, then stopped. Then again, harder this time. I grabbed my knife, my hands slick with sweat. I don't know how long I sat there, heart hammering in my chest, before the noises stopped. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, gripping that knife until my hand ached. When the sun finally rose, I checked the porch. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. But I knew someone had been there. I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up everything, threw my bags in the truck, and started the engine. Coughed, sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked the engine. I'm not a mechanic, but everything looked fine. Then I saw it, the fuel line. It had been cut. Someone had done this. Someone didn't want me to leave. Panic set in hard. I grabbed my bag, my knife, and my flashlight. I wasn't going to sit in that cabin another night. I started walking. I knew there was a ranger station about 10 miles south. If I kept moving, I could get there by morning. The forest felt different that night. The trees loomed taller, the shadows darker. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept the flashlight low, not wanting to draw attention. I walked fast, my breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. Then I heard it. Behind me, footsteps, heavy, steady, not running, just following. I didn't look back, couldn't. I just walked faster. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. The footsteps stayed with me, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see anything when I stole a glance over my shoulder. I don't remember when they stopped. Maybe they never did. Maybe my mind just blocked it out. But at some point, I saw a glow through the trees. The ranger station. I ran. My body screamed in protest, but I didn't stop until I reached the door, pounding on it with everything I had. A ranger opened it, looking confused. I must have looked like a madman. Sweaty, shaking, wild-eyed, I barely managed to tell him what happened. He let me in, gave me water, and called for a mechanic to check my truck the next day. When they towed it back to town, the mechanic confirmed it. The fuel line had been cut clean through. Too precise to be an animal. Too intentional to be an accident. I don't know who was out there watching me, waiting. I don't want to know. I sold my truck, took a bus home, and never went back to Montana. I still don't sleep well. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down I know better. I don't know why I agreed to go. Maybe it was the pressure of needing a break, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't as paranoid as I thought. Either way, when my old friend James invited me to his uncle's cabin deep in the woods of Montana, I said yes. It wasn't supposed to be anything crazy, just a weekend to unwind, fish, drink, and get away from the weight of daily life. James had been talking about this place for years, said it was his uncle's hunting cabin, barely used, quiet, and completely off the grid. No cell service, no power, just a wood stove and lanterns. It's peaceful, he told me. I thought that sounded nice. I needed some peace. We drove up on a Friday morning, packed light, just enough food, water, and gear to last a couple of days. The road turned to dirt about an hour before we reached the cabin, and soon after that, it was nothing but a narrow trail winding through dense forest. My truck barely fit between the trees, and the whole way up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding. The forest felt too quiet, the air too still. When we arrived, the cabin was smaller than I expected. A single-story structure, faded wood, a sagging roof, and a porch that creaked under our weight. It had clearly been there for a long time. James unlocked the door with a rusty key, and the inside smelled like dust and old wood. There was a main room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a single bedroom. The windows were grimy, and the floor had a slight tilt to it. "Cozy," James said, tossing his bag onto the floor. I nodded, but something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a weird feeling in my gut. The first day passed quietly. We fished at the nearby stream, made a fire, drank a few beers, and talked about nothing. The sun dipped early behind the trees, and by the time we made it back to the cabin, the air had turned ice cold. We lit the lanterns, made a simple dinner, and called it a night. James took the bedroom, and I set up my sleeping bag on the couch. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was freezing. I rolled over, half asleep, when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the frost-covered ground just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then, nothing, just silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been an animal and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no tracks, no signs of anything moving through the night. James laughed when I told him. "Probably just a deer," he said, "or your imagination." I let it go, but that feeling in my gut didn't. The second day, we hiked deeper into the woods. The further we got, the more uneasy I felt. The trees were thick, tangled, and the silence was suffocating. We found an old, abandoned campsite, a rusted fire pit, scattered trash, and a single boot half buried in the dirt. It looked like no one had been there for years, but something about it felt wrong. James barely seemed to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I locked the door. The fire burned strong, and I told myself there was nothing to worry about. But then, just like the night before, I woke up to a sound outside. This time it was closer, a scraping sound against the cabin walls. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. James was snoring in the bedroom. I reached for the lantern, but then the sound stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to see claw marks or footprints. But again, there was nothing, just that same unsettling silence. James wanted to stay another night. I told him I wanted to leave. He laughed, called me paranoid, but I didn't care. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. We packed up, locked the cabin, and started the drive back. The whole way down that dirt trail, I felt like something was watching us, like something was standing just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows. When we finally got back to town, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't tell James how bad it had gotten in my head. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. A few weeks later, James called me. He said his uncle had been up at the cabin and found something strange. The lock on the door had been broken. Inside, the furniture had been moved. The bed was pushed against the window, the table flipped over. The firewood we'd left was gone. And in the dust on the floor, there were footprints. Bare human footprints. Neither of us went back after that. I remember everything about that night, every smell, every sound. It stays with me not like a dream, but like a scar. Something that doesn't heal right. This happened years ago, but when I close my eyes and think about it, I swear I can still feel the cold creeping up my skin. It was 2013, late October. The air had that sharp bite that let you know winter was coming. I had rented a cabin out in the woods of northern Minnesota, way off from any town. It wasn't one of those nice, cozy cabins with a big stone fireplace and soft rugs. It was old and basic, for walls, a roof, and not much else. A friend of mine had stayed there the year before and told me about it. Said it was a good spot if you wanted to be alone for a while. I needed that. Work had been stressful. My personal life was a mess, and I just wanted to get away from everything. The drive out took longer than expected. The roads turned from pavement to dirt, then from dirt to barely anything at all. I had to slow down to a crawl just to avoid hitting the massive potholes and exposed roots. The sun had already started to dip behind the trees by the time I finally saw the cabin. It was smaller than I had pictured, maybe the size of a one-car garage. The wood was dark, almost black from years of exposure, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. A porch wrapped around the front, though the railing was broken in a few places. There were no other houses, no signs of life anywhere. Just trees stretching in every direction, closing in like walls. I stepped out of the car, the leaves crunching under my boots. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just a stillness that pressed against my ears. It felt unnatural, like the world had been muted. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods alone. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. Inside, the cabin was just as basic as I expected. A small wooden table sat in the middle, with 2 chairs pushed under it. A cot was shoved against the far wall, covered in a thin, stained mattress. There was no electricity, just a couple of old oil lamps sitting on a shelf. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, the metal rusted and dented. It smelled damp, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. I set my bag down on the cot and pulled out my flashlight. The last thing I wanted was to get stuck out here without light. I spent the next hour gathering firewood, stacking it near the stove. The sun had fully set by the time I was done, and the cold was settling in. I lit one of the oil lamps, its small flame barely pushing back the darkness. I didn't like how the shadows stretched across the walls, how they seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The first sign that something was wrong came later that night. I had been lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. That's when I heard it. A low, steady scraping sound outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew that right away. It was too controlled, too deliberate, like something was being dragged across the ground. I sat up slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then, just as I started to relax, it came again. A long, slow scrape. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam cutting through the darkness as I pointed it at the small window. Nothing, just trees and shadows. but the sound was still there, closer this time. I told myself it had to be the wind, maybe a branch dragging across the roof. But the trees weren't moving. There was no wind. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my hands sweating against the metal. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just listening. The sound stopped again, and I finally forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep, just closed my eyes and waited for morning. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside, scanning the ground around the cabin. The dirt was disturbed near the porch, like something had been dragged through it. But there were no footprints, no signs of anything that could have made the noise. Just long, deep marks in the soil. I should have left then, packed up and driven back to town. But I told myself I was being stupid. I had probably imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I spent the day hiking, trying to enjoy the fresh air, the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, the woods felt too quiet, like something was waiting. That night, it happened again. The same sound, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to open it. But I did. I shined the light outside, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing. But then, as I started to step back inside, I saw it. Something just beyond the tree line. It was low to the ground, hunched over. I couldn't make out its shape, but I knew it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there listening, waiting. The scraping sound didn't come back, but I knew it was still out there. By morning, I was done. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the car, not even bothering to check if I had left anything behind. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin sat there, empty and silent. But just before the trees swallowed it from view, I saw something move in the shadows. Watching, I never went back. I never told anyone what happened, but I still think about it. Late at night, when the world goes quiet, I can still hear that scraping sound in the back of my mind. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be visited. Some things aren't meant to be seen. And whatever was in those woods that night, it saw me. Maybe I just wanted some time away from the city, or maybe I felt guilty for not seeing Eric in so long. We used to be close, high school friends who drifted apart when life got in the way. When he invited me to his uncle's old cabin up north, it seemed like a good chance to catch up. I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere, but I figured some fresh air wouldn't kill me. The drive up was uneventful, just a long stretch of winding roads cutting through dense forest. The further we went, the more I started to feel uneasy. The trees loomed over us, casting thick shadows across the road, and the silence outside the car felt unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Old, weathered, and isolated. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt path, surrounded by nothing but thick woods and a small, still lake that reflected the overcast sky like glass. The place had been in Eric's family for decades, but from the looks of it, no one had been up here in years. The wood was gray with age, the windows were clouded with dirt, and the front door creaked loudly when we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. The furniture was old, the kind you'd find in a grandmother's house. Heavy wooden chairs, a floral-patterned couch, a bookshelf lined with outdated novels. The fireplace was stacked with logs, but I doubted they'd burn without filling the place with smoke. "We should get settled in before it gets dark," Eric said, dropping his duffel bag onto the floor with a thud. I nodded and took a look around. The cabin wasn't big, just one main room with a small kitchen in the corner, a bathroom that smelled like mildew, and 2 bedrooms with thin mattresses and stiff blankets. It was going to be a long weekend. The first night was uneventful. We drank a few beers, played cards, and talked about the usual things: work, relationships, old memories. The only thing that stood out was how quiet it was. The kind of silence that made you feel like the world had stopped existing outside these walls. I didn't sleep well. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind outside made my heart jump. I told myself I was being paranoid, just not used to being so far from civilization. But the feeling stayed with me, that sense of being watched. The next morning, I woke up groggy and sore. Eric was already outside, standing by the edge of the lake. He was staring at something in the water, but when I stepped outside, he turned quickly and acted like nothing was wrong. I didn't ask. We spent the day hiking through the woods, following old trails that had nearly disappeared under fallen leaves. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, and the deeper we went, the more I noticed how still everything was. I've been in the woods before. I know what they should sound like. Birds, squirrels, the distant rustle of leaves. But here there was nothing, just the sound of our own footsteps. At some point, we found an old hunting stand, barely holding itself together. The wood was rotting, the ladder missing a few steps. Eric climbed up anyway, peering out over the trees. "Looks like there's a clearing a little ways out," he said. "Wanna check it out?" I shrugged. We didn't have anything else to do. The clearing wasn't much, a patch of dead grass surrounded by thick trees. But there was something in the middle of it, something strange. Bones. At first, I thought it was just an old deer carcass, but as we got closer, I realized how wrong I was. The bones were too long, too thin. Some of them were broken, splintered like something had chewed through them. Eric was quiet. He just stood there, staring. "We should go," I muttered. He nodded. We didn't talk much on the way back. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like something was following us. I didn't see anything, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, rattling the windows. I lay awake in the dark, listening. Just as I started to drift off, I heard something, a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listened. The steps moved around the cabin, circling it. The floor creaked in the other room. Eric was awake, too. Then silence. I didn't move. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, Eric looked like he hadn't slept at all. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he sipped his coffee. "We should leave," he said finally. I didn't argue. We packed our things quickly, barely speaking. I stepped outside to load my bag into the car and stopped. In the dirt just outside the cabin were footprints, bare footprints, leading from the woods to the cabin and then back again. I didn't say anything. I just got in the car. We didn't talk on the drive back. I never asked Eric what he saw in the lake that morning, and I don't think I ever want to know. It was 2013. I was 29, going through a rough patch in my life, and I thought some time alone would do me good. A friend of a friend had a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, and they were kind enough to let me use it for a week. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a bed, and a small kitchen. It was exactly what I needed. A chance to unplug, clear my head, and figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. The drive out there took nearly 4 hours. The last 30 miles were on a narrow dirt road, winding through dense forest. My cell signal had dropped out long before I reached the turnoff. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The place was smaller than I expected. Just one room with a loft above the bed, a small porch out front, and an old outhouse about 20 yards away. It felt isolated. Perfect, I told myself. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the wood stove, cooked some canned soup on a propane burner, and read by lantern light. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the distant call of an owl. The quiet was a little unsettling at first, but I reminded myself that I had wanted this. The second day, I explored the woods. There were no marked trails, but I had a compass and a decent sense of direction. I wandered for hours, breathing in the crisp autumn air, letting my mind wander. I found a small stream, followed it for a while, then turned back when the sun started dipping toward the horizon. That was when I first felt it. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense that something was off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling underbrush, just the wind in the trees. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd gotten used to the background noise of civilization and the silence was making me paranoid. Still, I picked up my pace, glancing over my shoulder more often than I like to admit. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun had almost set. I shook off the feeling, made myself some dinner, and settled in for another quiet night. Then, around midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was unmistakable, something moving just beyond the porch. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived, and the nearest cabin was miles away. Another footstep, closer this time. I reached for the hunting knife I'd brought with me, gripping it tightly. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about the way it moved told me otherwise. It wasn't the cautious shuffle of a scavenging animal. It was slow, purposeful. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, then more. The sound didn't come again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself I had imagined it. I was alone. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They led from the trees to the porch, stopping just feet from the door. My stomach turned as I followed them around the side of the cabin. They circled the entire building. Whoever it was had been watching me. I spent the day trying to shake the fear. Maybe it was a hunter who had gotten lost. Maybe some local messing with me. I told myself a lot of things, but deep down I knew. That night, I locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and kept my knife within reach. I barely slept. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were slower, closer. They stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I shot out of bed, heart hammering. The knob jiggled again, harder this time. I grabbed my knife, ready to fight if I had to. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. When dawn finally broke, I found fresh footprints leading away from the cabin. I left that morning. I didn't pack. I didn't clean up. I just grabbed my keys and drove, barely stopping until I reached the main road. When I finally got a signal, I called my friend and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "You're not the first." That was all he said. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. I never went back. I remember the cold more than anything. It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones and made you feel hollow. The kind of cold that turned every breath into a cloud and made your fingers ache. But that wasn't what scared me. Not at first. I had driven up to the cabin late in the afternoon. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, the quiet, and the woods. A break from the noise of the city, from work, from everything. My uncle had owned the cabin for years, but he hadn't been up there in a long time. He had offered it to me when I mentioned needing to get away. "It's isolated," he said. "No cell service, no neighbors for miles. It'll be good for you." I liked the sound of that. The drive was uneventful, long stretches of empty roads winding through the woods. The sun was starting to dip below the trees by the time I arrived, casting everything in long shadows. The cabin was just as I remembered from childhood visits. Small, weathered, nestled between towering pines. It looked lonely. I parked the car and grabbed my bags. The door was stiff, the wood swollen from years of harsh winters, but it gave after a few hard shoves. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. I flipped the light switch. Nothing. I had expected that. My uncle told me the generator would need to be started. It was behind the cabin, a clunky old thing that rattled and coughed when I finally got it going. The lights flickered on, casting long, pale beams across the room. Inside, it was exactly how I remembered. Same furniture, same old fireplace, same set of hunting knives mounted above the kitchen counter. It was unsettling how little had changed. The first night was uneventful. I made a quick dinner, lit a fire, and sat in silence, letting the warmth seep into me. The wind picked up outside, whispering through the trees. I didn't mind it. It was peaceful. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. I woke up sometime in the night, heart hammering. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. The wind had stopped. The silence was absolute, thick enough to feel. And then came the sound. A single, deliberate step outside. I froze. It wasn't the shuffle of an animal or the crunch of a branch in the wind. It was a footstep. Slow, heavy, close. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, every muscle tensed, ears straining. Nothing. Then, another step. Closer this time. The rational part of my brain fought to take control. It had to be an animal. A deer, maybe. A bear. But deep down, I knew better. Animals don't move like that. They don't walk with purpose. I reached for my phone before remembering, no service. The landline in the cabin hadn't worked in years. My only real option was the rifle my uncle kept locked in the cabinet. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, feeling my way through the darkness, every creak of the floorboards making my pulse spike. Another step, right outside the door now. I reached the cabinet, fingers fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to focus, to turn the combination slowly. Another step, a breath low, measured, just on the other side of the wall. The lock clicked open. I grabbed the rifle and stepped back, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Silence. I waited, rifle raised, staring at the door. The seconds dragged by. Nothing happened. No more footsteps. No more breathing. I stood there for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally won. I sat in the chair by the door, rifle across my lap, and waited for morning. Daylight made it feel ridiculous. There were no footprints in the frost outside. No sign that anyone had been there. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But I didn't believe it. I forced myself through the day, chopping wood, walking the perimeter, keeping busy. The whole time I felt watched. The trees pressed in too close, the shadows too deep. But there was nothing. No signs, no proof. That night, I locked the door and bolted the windows. The rifle stayed at my side. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then, just past midnight, the footsteps came back. Slow, steady, right up to the door. Then silence. My grip on the rifle tightened. I didn't move. I barely breathed. And then the knob turned. The sound was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. A slow, deliberate testing of the lock. A pause. Then the quiet click of it turning back into place. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Then the footsteps moved again. Not away. Around. I followed the sound as it circled the cabin, each step measured, careful. Then it stopped. Right outside the bedroom window. I didn't dare turn my head, didn't dare look. I could feel it there, standing, watching. Then, after what felt like forever, it moved again, slowly, back to the front door. Another pause, then finally retreating steps, fading, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I went outside, forcing myself to look. The ground was hard, frozen. There were no footprints, nothing. But I knew what I had heard. I packed my bags. I didn't stay another night. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked, how paranoid it seemed. I left, locking the cabin behind me, and drove without stopping until I was home. I never went back. My uncle sold the cabin a few years later. I never asked who bought it. Some things are better left alone. I never should have gone to that cabin. I told myself that over and over again as I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But the damage was done. The sun had already started to sink behind the thick line of trees, and I had no choice but to go inside. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, just a few days alone in a rented cabin deep in the Tennessee woods. I had been working nonstop for months, stuck in a stuffy office under flickering fluorescent lights, and the thought of fresh air and silence had been too tempting to resist. The listing online had shown a simple one-bedroom cabin. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and unwind. It was far from any towns, down a winding dirt road that cut through thick forest, the kind of place where cell service barely existed. That had been part of the appeal at first. Now, sitting there in the creeping dusk, it felt like a mistake. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was thick and still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The trees stretched high, their tangled limbs blocking out what little light remained. The cabin itself sat back from the road, small and dark, the porch light flickering weakly. The key had been left under a loose stone near the front door, just like the owner said. I bent down to grab it, but as I did, I caught a whiff of something strange. An odd, sour scent that made my stomach twist. It was faint, almost gone as soon as I noticed it, but it was there. My mind immediately went to an animal carcass. That wouldn't be too strange this deep in the woods. Still, it made my skin crawl. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been in here for a long time. The cabin was exactly as advertised. A single room with a small kitchen in the corner, a worn-out couch, and a bed tucked against the far wall. A bathroom door stood half open near the back. I set my bag down and locked the door behind me. As much as I tried to shake it off, something about the place felt off. Not haunted, not anything supernatural, but just wrong. The silence was thick, pressing in from all sides, and the smell lingered in the background, faint but persistent. I checked my phone. No service. That wasn't surprising, but it still made me uneasy. I turned on the old radio sitting on the kitchen counter. Static. I twisted the knob, trying to find anything. A music station, talk radio, anything. Just more static. Frustrated, I turned it off and sat down on the couch. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was in the middle of nowhere, in a place I wasn't used to. Of course, it felt weird. I just needed to relax. I heated up a can of soup for dinner, eating it straight out of the pot. It was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up every few minutes, but every time I looked around, there was nothing. I decided to call it a night early. I locked the front door, double-checked the windows, and got into bed. The sheets smelled musty, but I was too tired to care. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. Then something woke me up. It was subtle at first. Faint sound just outside, like something brushing against the cabin walls. I held my breath, straining to hear. A few seconds passed. Silence. Then a soft creak. The porch. My heart started pounding. I reached for my phone, but there was nothing. No signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. My truck was outside, but that meant stepping onto the porch where whatever was out there had just been. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but I couldn't make myself believe it. The sound had been deliberate, slow, careful. I stayed frozen in bed for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of my truck's door slamming shut. I sat up so fast my head spun. The first light of morning was creeping through the trees, casting long shadows across the room. My stomach twisted. Someone had been inside my truck. I threw on my boots and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. When I stepped outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth. The truck was sitting exactly where I left it, but the driver's side door was slightly open. I checked the seats, the floor. My keys were still in my bag inside the cabin, so it wasn't stolen. But the glove box was open, and the contents were scattered across the passenger seat. Someone had been searching for something. I felt exposed standing out there. The woods stretched around me, deep and dark, and for the first time, I realized how completely alone I was. I didn't know who had been here last night. I didn't know if they were watching me now. I locked the truck, backed away, and went inside. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care if I had booked the place for 2 more nights. I wasn't staying another hour. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see someone sitting in the back seat. Every time I passed a break in the trees, I braced myself for the sight of a figure standing there, watching. I never saw anyone, but I know they were there. Whoever had been outside my cabin, whoever had gone through my truck, they were real, and I have no idea what they wanted. I never wanted to go on that trip. My cousin Ryan had been begging me for months, saying we needed to get away, unplug, and do something different for once. I wasn't against the idea of a weekend in the woods, but something about the thought of staying in a remote cabin didn't sit right with me. I wasn't sure why, but I ignored that gut feeling. I told myself I was just overthinking, like always. Ryan found some rundown cabin on an old rental site, a place tucked away in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The photos looked rough, grayish wood, a sagging porch, windows that seemed too dark. The listing called it rustic, which was code for falling apart. But Ryan was all in. "It's perfect," he'd said. "Total isolation. No phone service, no neighbors. Just the woods and us." We drove up on a Friday in late October. The trees were almost bare, their leaves scattered across the winding road like a thick, wet carpet. The drive took longer than expected, thanks to rough gravel roads that our tires barely gripped. The cabin was deeper in the woods than I imagined, and the moment we pulled up, I felt uneasy. The place looked worse in person. The roof sagged more than in the pictures, and the porch had a slight lean, like the whole structure was settling unevenly. It was a single-story place, smaller than expected, with an old, rusted-out truck parked to the side. It didn't belong to us. It hadn't been mentioned in the listing. Ryan didn't seem bothered. He grabbed our bags, unlocked the door, and walked right in like we owned the place. I hesitated, glancing at the truck again, then at the dense forest behind us. The trees stood too close together, almost unnaturally packed, their bare branches tangled overhead. I followed him in, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The inside smelled like dust and rotting wood. The air was stale, like no one had been inside for a long time. The furniture was old and mismatched, the couch sagging in the middle, the chairs covered in frayed fabric. The kitchen had an old white fridge, yellowed with age, and a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was one bedroom with 2 twin beds, a single bathroom with a tiny, cracked mirror, and a back door that led to a small porch. The forest was visible from there, stretching out into an endless wall of trees. That first night, I slept like shit. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. No distant cars, no hum of electricity, just nothing. Every creak of the cabin felt too loud. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something outside. The next morning, Ryan wanted to hike. I wanted to leave. I didn't say it outright, but I kept dropping hints. "The cabin's not in great shape," I pointed out. "And that truck outside, probably the owner's," Ryan said. "Maybe he left it here." I didn't buy it. The truck looked abandoned, but not ancient. The tires weren't flat, and the windshield wasn't covered in leaves. Someone had driven it here not too long ago. We hiked anyway. The trail behind the cabin led deeper into the woods, past gnarled trees and damp, rotting logs. The farther we walked, the more I felt it, the sense that something wasn't right. The silence was wrong. I didn't hear birds or insects, just the sound of our boots crunching leaves. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. We found a clearing a few miles in. An old fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by broken beer bottles and rusted cans. Someone had been here before us, but not recently. The logs around the fire pit were damp and starting to decay. That's when I noticed the tree. It was covered in deep, deliberate cuts. Not random marks, carvings. Words, but not full sentences. Just scattered phrases, some letters too deep to read clearly. Leave. Watching. Not safe. Ryan laughed it off. Some bored hunter trying to freak people out, he said, but I wasn't convinced. The letters were too fresh, the edges too sharp. Someone had done this recently. I told Ryan we should head back. He rolled his eyes but didn't argue. The whole walk back, I felt that creeping sensation again, the feeling of being watched. We made it back to the cabin before sunset, but my nerves didn't settle. I kept thinking about the truck, about the carvings, about how damn quiet it was out here. Ryan made a fire in the small fireplace. The cabin had no TV, no radio, just the two of us, the firelight flickering against the walls. I tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't. Then, just past midnight, I woke up. Something had moved outside. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows. Ryan was still asleep, snoring lightly. I held my breath, straining to hear. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the rustling of trees. Slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I didn't move. My body locked up, heart hammering in my chest. Then, the doorknob rattled. Not just once. Not the wind. Someone was trying to turn it, testing if it was locked. I reached out and shook Ryan awake. He groggily sat up, but before I could say anything, we both heard it. The sound of footsteps retreating, moving away from the porch. We sat there, frozen, listening as whoever or whatever it was disappeared into the trees. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and, despite my protests, crept to the front window. He shined it outside, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the old truck, the empty porch. We barely slept the rest of the night. By morning, I was done. We need to leave, I told Ryan. He didn't argue this time. We packed up fast, throwing everything into the truck, not even bothering to clean up. As I tossed my bag in the back seat, I saw it. Footprints. Deep, fresh, leading from the porch into the woods. Someone had been here, watching us, waiting. I didn't say anything to Ryan. I just got in the truck, locked the doors, and didn't look back. We drove in silence for miles, only relaxing once we hit the main road. Later, when we checked the rental site, the listing was gone. The cabin wasn't there anymore. No record of it, like it never existed. Ryan tried to brush it off, but I knew better. Someone had been out there, and they weren't expecting us to leave. It was an old place, deep in the woods of northern Montana, built by my grandfather in the late 60s. The family barely used it anymore, but after my divorce, I needed space. Somewhere quiet, away from the mess of court papers and lawyers. A place to breathe. The drive up was easy enough. A long stretch of highway, then an hour on dirt roads winding through thick pine forests. No cell service out there. Just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional deer darting across the road. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange kind of weight settle on my chest. I brushed it off as stress. Too much on my mind. The cabin was just as I remembered. Gray wood, sagging porch, a rusting wind chime barely clinging to the rafters. The door stuck a little before it gave way, the smell of old wood and dust rushing out to greet me. Inside, everything was still in place. The small kitchen, the wood stove in the corner, the single bedroom with its stiff mattress. I dropped my bag and set to work, opening windows, sweeping, trying to make it feel less abandoned. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. The quiet out there was different. Not peaceful, but heavy. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I locked the door, checked the windows, and crawled into bed, trying not to think about how alone I was. The first night was uneventful. I woke up cold, threw more wood in the stove, and went back to sleep. But the second night, something changed. I woke up to a sound, a dull, steady thudding, like something heavy hitting wood. It was coming from outside. I lay there, listening, my pulse hammering in my ears. At first, I thought it was an animal, a bear maybe pawing at the side of the cabin. But it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. I forced myself up, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. I crept to the window and peered out. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the clearing, but I didn't see anything. The trees stood still. The forest looked empty. I waited, barely breathing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a figure at the edge of the trees, too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They were standing completely still, facing the cabin. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight like it could do anything against whoever or whatever was out there. Then, just as I blinked, they were gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I searched the clearing. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Maybe I had imagined it. Stress, exhaustion. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But when night came again, the thudding returned. This time, I didn't move. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. The sound came from the same place. Steady, unrelenting. I don't know how long I listened before it finally stopped, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone out there. Morning light felt like a relief, but the fear sat heavy in my gut. I needed to leave, but as I packed, I found something that stopped me cold. By the door, in the thin layer of dust on the wooden floor, were footprints. Bare, human. They hadn't been there the night before. I left everything and got in my truck, driving faster than was safe down the winding road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, until I saw the first signs of town. Only then did I pull over, shaking, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I never went back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that sound. The rain had started around noon, slow at first, but by late afternoon, it was hammering the windshield like handfuls of pebbles. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and slick, winding through dense trees that swallowed the last of the daylight. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the signal on my phone had disappeared miles back. I was heading to a remote cabin up in the mountains, a last-minute decision. It belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I didn't know personally, but I'd been assured it was stocked with everything I'd need. A break from work, from people, from everything. I needed the quiet. The directions had been straightforward. Follow the main highway, turn onto a smaller road after the old gas station, then a final stretch of unpaved path leading into the forest. It was that last part that had me uneasy. Mud splattered against the sides of my car as I inched along, the tires struggling for grip. Trees loomed on both sides, bending under the wind. The cabin appeared suddenly, barely visible in the downpour. A single-story structure, made of old, dark wood, with a slanted roof and a wide porch. It looked sturdy enough, though clearly aged. A stack of firewood sat under a tarp by the door. I parked, shut off the engine, and let the silence settle. No other houses, no streetlights, just the endless hiss of rain and the creak of trees shifting in the wind. Inside, the air was stale but dry. The place smelled of old wood and dust, with a hint of something I couldn't place. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom down the hall. It was basic, but clean enough. I found the light switches, flicked them on, and dropped my bag by the couch. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. That was expected, but I still didn't like it. There was an old landline on the wall, but when I lifted the receiver, I was met with silence. I turned my focus to the wood stove. The temperature had dropped, and I wasn't about to spend the night shivering. The wood was dry, and with some effort, I had a fire going. The warmth spread slowly, cutting through the damp chill. Dinner was simple, a can of soup heated over the gas stove. I ate by the fire, listening to the rain hammer the roof. Every so often, the wind sent a shudder through the cabin, making the walls creak. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start. The fire had burned low, the embers casting faint orange glows across the room. The rain had slowed, replaced by a steady dripping from the eaves. Then I heard it, a sound outside. Not the wind, not the rain, something deliberate. A soft crunch, like a footstep on wet ground. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Silence. Just the wind again, rustling through the trees. Probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon. Still, I moved quietly to the window. The porch light flickered against the wet ground, illuminating the yard. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind, the dark outline of my car. I shook my head and turned back toward the couch, and froze. The front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I was certain. But now the deadbolt was turned, the latch loose. I stared at it, my breath shallow. Had I forgotten? Maybe. I'd been exhausted, distracted. But my gut said otherwise. Slowly, I reached out and locked it again, pressing the door to make sure it was secure. My ears rang with silence, my own breathing too loud. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting. Nothing happened. No more noises. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a mistake, some lapse in memory. Still, I barely slept that night. The morning was gray and misty, the rain reduced to a light drizzle. I stepped outside with my coffee, scanning the yard. Nothing looked disturbed. The muddy ground showed no clear footprints, only the tracks from my own car. Shaking off the unease, I decided to hike a little. There was a trail behind the cabin, leading up through the trees. The air was crisp, damp with the scent of wet earth. I walked for maybe an hour, the quiet starting to settle me. Then I saw something. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I got closer, my stomach twisted. A length of rope dangled from a low branch, knotted at the end. Old, frayed, weathered from time. It looked like a noose. A cold shiver ran through me. It was probably just an old hunting snare, I told myself. But it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong. I turned back, walking faster now. The closer I got to the cabin, the more unsettled I felt. Then I saw it. My front door wide open. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. I stood at the edge of the clearing, every muscle in my body tense. There was no sign of movement inside, no sounds. Just the door swinging slightly in the breeze. I clenched the fire poker in my hand and stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I crossed the porch. My own breath felt deafening. Inside, nothing looked different. Nothing looked touched. And then I saw them. Boot prints, muddy, fresh, leading from the door into the bedroom. I didn't check. I didn't want to. I turned, grabbed my keys, and ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock, the engine sputtering before roaring to life. I didn't look back as I drove, didn't slow down until I hit the main road. By the time I reached town, my hands had stopped shaking. I found a diner, parked, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I never called the cops, never told anyone. What would I have said? That I got spooked? That someone had been out there, messing with me? All I knew was that I wasn't alone out there, and that someone, whoever they were, had been watching me the whole time. I never liked the idea of staying in a cabin alone, but I told myself it would be good for me. A weekend away from the city, away from the noise and the constant stress of life. Just me, a small rented cabin deep in the Montana woods, and a few books to keep me company. No cell service, no internet, just silence. Peace. Took me nearly 4 hours to drive out there from my apartment. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all, just a narrow dirt path winding through thick trees. My car's tires kicked up dust as I navigated the rough terrain, feeling the occasional jolt when I hit a pothole too hard. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No traffic, no voices, not even birds. Just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The cabin itself was small and old but sturdy. A single-story structure with a slanted tin roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was dark and weathered, and the front door had deep scratches on it. Not the kind a bear would make, too narrow, too precise. It looked more like someone had taken a knife and dragged it down the wood over and over again. I told myself it was nothing, probably just an old door with years of wear. I unloaded my bags, stepped inside, and breathed in the musty scent of aged wood. The interior was simple. A small kitchen with an old gas stove, a living room with a worn-out couch, and a fireplace with a pile of neatly stacked logs beside it. A single bedroom with a wooden bed frame and a thin mattress. The silence inside felt heavier than it did outside. I checked the windows. They were locked. The back door too. There was no electricity, but I had brought a battery-powered lantern. I set it on the kitchen counter and flicked it on, filling the space with a dull yellow light. I spent the first couple of hours just settling in, making sure I had everything I needed. I boiled some water on the stove for coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the sun start to set behind the trees. That's when I noticed something. The forest felt too still. I had been camping before. I knew what the woods sounded like at dusk. Birds, insects, the occasional crack of a branch as an animal moved through the underbrush. But here there was nothing, just the wind and the trees. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my own nerves. But then I saw something, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. My first thought was that it was another person, maybe a hunter, maybe someone who lived nearby. But they weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape blending into the trees. I stood up, trying to get a better look. It was gone. I rubbed my eyes, shook my head. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and kept my lantern on beside the bed. I told myself it was just my mind overreacting, that I'd wake up in the morning and laugh at myself for being so paranoid. But I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something outside. Not footsteps, something softer. A rustling, a faint scraping against the wooden porch. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. My breath caught in my throat. The room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the lantern on the nightstand. The tapping was slow, deliberate. I didn't move. It stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from outside, a low whistle, a tune I didn't recognize. It sent a chill through me. I forced myself to sit up, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the lantern, stood up, and inched toward the window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Nothing. The trees stood still in the moonlight. The porch was empty, but the scratches on the door were deeper. I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, and my knife and decided I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag over my shoulder and stepped outside. The air was cold, too cold for summer. My breath fogged up in front of me as I moved toward my car. I stopped. The driver's side door was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. I shined my flashlight inside. The seats were torn, deep gashes in the upholstery. A sick feeling settled in my gut. Something was out here, and it wanted me to know. I didn't get in the car. Couldn't. If someone was messing with me, they could be inside, waiting. Instead, I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I had to think. The nearest town was miles away. Running in the dark wasn't an option. Then that whistle again. Closer this time. I turned and bolted for the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking. My mind was screaming at me to get out, but I couldn't. Not yet. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a rusted fire poker from beside the fireplace. I sat in the corner of the living room, gripping it so tight my knuckles turned white. The whistle came again, right outside the door. I held my breath, then scratching, slow, deliberate, long, deep marks being carved into the wood. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours. The scratches stopped. The whistling faded into the distance. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have passed out. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I hesitated before checking the door, but when I did, my stomach dropped. The scratches were even deeper. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and sprinted to my car. I didn't check the back seat. I didn't care. I just got in, turned the key, and prayed the engine would start. It did. I tore out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station I could find, an hour away. I told myself I'd report it, but what would I even say? Someone whistled at me in the woods? My car got scratched up? I never went back to that cabin. Never even tried to find it on a map. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that same whistle. And I know, deep down, whatever was out there that night, it remembers me too. I had always been the type of person who enjoyed being alone. Not in an antisocial way, but in a way where solitude felt like a deep breath of fresh air. So when I got the chance to rent a remote cabin for a week, deep in the Appalachian woods, I jumped at the opportunity. It was late October. The air was cold but not unbearable, and I had planned for nothing but peace, reading, and maybe some hiking if I felt up to it. The cabin was exactly what I wanted. Small, old but well-kept, and completely off-grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a wood stove, a well outside for water, and a small generator for power if I needed it. The rental owner, a man in his 60s named Carl, had met me at the nearest town before leading me up the winding dirt roads. "You'll be the only one up here this time of year," he told me before leaving. "Most folks don't come this late. Gets dark too early, and the weather turns quick." I didn't mind. That was the whole point, to be alone. The first 2 days were exactly what I had hoped for. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on the porch, listening to the rustling leaves. Afternoons were spent exploring the surrounding woods, following narrow deer trails, sometimes stopping by the small creek about a mile from the cabin. Evenings were the best, sitting by the fire, reading by lantern light until I got tired. The third night was when I started noticing little things that felt off. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound outside, something moving through the leaves. I wasn't alarmed at first. I had seen plenty of deer during the day, even spotted what I thought was a black bear farther up the mountain. But the sound didn't seem right. It wasn't the cautious steps of an animal foraging. It was slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully. I sat up, listening. It stopped. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon or some other night creature. But as I settled back down, I realized I wasn't as comfortable as before. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I forced myself to go about my plans. Made breakfast, read for a bit, then decided to hike down to the creek again. But something was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped walking, the woods felt unnaturally silent, like they were holding their breath. The feeling stuck with me even after I got back to the cabin, but I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, I locked the doors. I hadn't bothered before, not way out here, but something about the woods being so quiet made me uneasy. At around 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time, there was no sound, just a feeling, a deep, gut-level feeling that I was not alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the flashlight by my bed. I clicked it on and swept the beam across the small room. Everything looked normal, but my nerves were shot. Then the sound started again. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. Closer this time. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and steady. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? But why wouldn't they call out? Why would they be moving like that, circling the cabin in the dead of night? I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps stopped by the front door. The handle didn't turn. The door didn't rattle. Whoever it was just stood there. My throat was dry. My hands clenched so tightly around the flashlight that they ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, but the ground was covered in fallen leaves, making it hard to tell. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was a trick of the wind, a falling branch. But deep down, I knew better. I thought about packing up and leaving, but my pride got in the way. I had paid for the whole week, and I wasn't about to let my own paranoia ruin it. That night, I kept the lantern on and dozed off sitting up, my rifle resting across my lap. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. This time it was different. The footsteps were back, but now they were lighter, faster, almost playful. They stopped and started like someone testing the ground. Then came a new sound, a quiet, tapping noise on the window nearest to me. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. My eyes were locked on the glass, but the lantern's light reflected too much for me to see anything outside. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped the rifle so hard my knuckles popped. My mind raced. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. They knew I wasn't asleep, and they were playing with me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window. I lifted the rifle barrel first, then jerked the curtain aside. Nothing. The tapping stopped. The night stared back at me, empty and silent. That was enough for me. The first light, I packed my things and got the hell out of there. I barely slept that night, and every second I spent in that cabin felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. By the time I made it back to town, I felt ridiculous for how shaken I was. Maybe it had been an animal, the wind, my imagination running wild. But when I stopped at the gas station before leaving, I mentioned it to the clerk, just to see their reaction. She went pale. "You were in that cabin? The one Carl rents out?" I nodded. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "You ain't the first person to leave early." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" She glanced around, like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "Few years back, some guy left in the middle of the night. Said he saw someone standing in the woods watching the cabin. Next morning, he found footprints all around the place. Only thing was, they weren't shoe prints. Bare feet. Middle of winter. I felt cold all over. I paid for my gas and got in my car. I never looked back." I didn't believe anything was wrong with the place at first. It was just a cabin, a rundown, forgotten thing sitting deep in the woods of northern Montana. No cell service, no neighbors for miles. Exactly what I wanted. I needed to get away from everything for a while. I rented it online, some guy named Carl listing it as an off-grid retreat. Said he'd fixed it up himself. There were pictures, bare bones, but fine. A bed, a table, a fireplace, a small kitchen. No running water, but there was a well out back. No electricity, but there were solar-powered lanterns. I didn't mind roughing it. I packed up a week's worth of food, a few gallons of water, a good hunting knife, and my old rifle. The drive out there took forever. The last hour was on a dirt road, all ruts and potholes. The kind that rattles your teeth and makes you question if your car will survive. Trees pressed in on both sides, tall and thick, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. The GPS lost signal about 20 minutes in. I wasn't worried. I had the directions printed out. I found the cabin just where Carl had said it'd be. Small, old, logs darkened with age. A tiny porch, one rocking chair. The door was thick, solid. The windows had heavy wooden shutters, some left slightly open. The first thing that struck me was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind that makes you feel at ease. It was the kind that feels wrong. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just my own breathing and the sound of my boots on the wooden steps. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The air was heavy, stale. The floor creaked under my weight as I walked around. There was a fireplace, blackened with old soot. A single bed with a thin mattress. A small wooden table with a single chair. The kitchen was just a counter with an old propane stove. There was a door in the back. I opened it, expecting maybe a storage closet, but it was just an empty room. No windows, just walls, floor, ceiling. Felt wrong. Too small, too tight. I shut the door fast and left my bag on the table. Night came quick. I lit a lantern and set it on the table. The glow barely reached the corners of the cabin. I ate a can of beans cold and sat on the porch, looking at the woods. The trees were black shapes against a deep blue sky. stars thick overhead. Still no wind, no sounds. I told myself it was just different. I wasn't used to it. The city was never this quiet. I turned in early, stretched out on the bed, the knife under my pillow. I left the lantern burning low. I woke up to a sound, soft, like something dragging against wood. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then again closer. A slow, deliberate scrape, like nails or claws on the porch. My pulse slammed in my ears. I sat up, reaching for the knife. The lantern still flickered, throwing shadows on the walls. I stayed still for what felt like hours, staring at the door. Nothing. Maybe an animal, a raccoon, a stray dog, something looking for food. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came gray and cold. I went outside. The porch was empty. No tracks, no marks. The air was thick, damp. I felt watched, like something was just beyond the trees, waiting. I shook it off. I wasn't about to be scared off by my own imagination. I spent the day exploring a little, checking out the well. It was deep, the water dark. A bucket hung from a rope, old but sturdy. I hauled some up, washed my face. Smelled fine, tasted fine. I hiked a bit, rifle slung over my shoulder. The woods were dense, branches clawing at my jacket. The ground was soft in places, damp leaves sinking under my boots. Half a mile from the cabin, I found something strange. Clearing, dead silent. Trees bent inward, branches twisted, and in the center an old campsite, or what was left of one. A fire pit, half buried in leaves. Rusted cans. A torn sleeping bag weathered from years in the elements. And bones. Small ones, scattered. Too clean, too old to smell. I told myself they were animal bones. A deer, maybe. A fox. But there was a sinking feeling in my gut. A tightness in my chest. I turned back. The walk felt longer going back. The air had that weight again, like it was pressing down. By the time I reached the cabin, my skin was cold, my stomach tight. That night, the noise came back, louder, a slow drag, then a tap, 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 like something testing the wood. I held my breath. The rifle was next to me now, loaded, then scratching, slow, deliberate, just outside the door. I swallowed, my throat dry. It wasn't the wind. I got up, heart pounding, stepped toward the door. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I forced myself to lie down, but I didn't sleep. Morning was a relief. I went outside. The ground was disturbed. The porch had fresh scratches in the wood, long and deep. Not a raccoon. Not a stray dog. I packed up, fast. I didn't care about the food, the water. I threw my bag in the truck and started the engine. It roared to life. Relief flooded me. Then I saw it. In the trees, far back but there. Something standing between the trunks. Not moving, just watching. Tall, thin. I didn't look too long. I didn't need to. I threw the truck in reverse, gravel kicking up as I spun around. The road was rough, but I didn't slow down. I glanced in the mirror once. Nothing. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I never told anyone. Never went back. Carl's listing disappeared not long after. I looked once out of curiosity, but it was gone. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back to the woods alone again. The road to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path cutting through the dense trees. The rental car rattled over every bump, tires spitting up dust and small stones. It was late afternoon, the sun starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the road. I had the windows rolled down, the warm summer air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The radio lost its signal miles back, leaving me alone with the sound of the engine and the occasional chirp of unseen birds. I had been looking forward to this trip. A week away from the city, from the noise, the constant pull of responsibilities. No emails, no phone calls. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. My friend Peter owned the cabin, though he hadn't been up here in a while. He'd warned me that it might be a little rough around the edges, but I didn't mind. The idea of solitude appealed to me more than anything. The cabin came into view suddenly, appearing from behind a bend in the road. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a steeply pitched roof and a wraparound porch. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar. I felt a small prickle of unease. Peter had said he left a key under a loose board on the porch, but he hadn't mentioned the door being open. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The woods pressed in close, the air heavy with silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps as I climbed onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight. I hesitated at the door, then pushed it open wider. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. Sunlight filtered through the dirty windows, casting long beams across the wooden floor. I stepped inside, glancing around. A small living area took up most of the space, a battered couch pushed against the wall, a stone fireplace with a few logs stacked beside it. A tiny kitchen sat in the back, a single counter lined with old dishes and a rusting coffee maker. A doorway led to what I assumed was the bedroom. The cabin was basic, but it would do. I found the light switch near the door, flicked it on. Nothing. The power was out. Peter had mentioned that might happen. The generator out back was temperamental. I sighed and made a mental note to check it after unloading my bags. I went back to the car, grabbed my backpack and the cooler I had packed with enough food for the week. When I stepped back onto the porch, I stopped. The door was closed. I frowned. I was sure I had left it open. I stood there for a long moment, the hair on my arms prickling. Maybe the wind had blown it shut, though I hadn't felt even the smallest breeze since arriving. I shook it off and went inside, setting my things down on the counter. The bedroom was small, just a single bed with a thin mattress, a wooden dresser, and a dusty window overlooking the back of the property. A door led to a tiny bathroom with an old clawfoot tub. I set my toiletries down, ran the faucet. A weak trickle of brown water sputtered out, then cleared after a few seconds. At least the plumbing still worked. I spent the next hour settling in, unpacking, checking the cabinets for supplies. There were a few cans of food, a box of matches, a flashlight with dead batteries. I found an old lantern under the sink, the glass covered in soot. I cleaned it off and set it on the table for later. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep shade of blue. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped outside, making my way around to the back of the cabin where the generator sat under a small overhang. It was old, rusted in places, but after a few tries, it rumbled to life. The lights inside flickered on. I let out a breath, relieved. At least I wouldn't be stuck in total darkness. Back inside, I made a simple dinner, canned soup heated over the gas stove. I ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. The stillness was unnerving. Even in the deepest parts of the forest, there should be noise, crickets, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But here there was nothing, just silence, thick and heavy. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening. The cabin creaked, settling on its foundation. The wind picked up outside, branches tapping against the roof. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the unease curling in my stomach. It was just an old cabin, nothing more. At some point, I drifted off. I woke to a sound, a soft creak, like footsteps on the porch. My breath caught in my throat. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. Another creak, slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. I slid out of bed, moving carefully to avoid making any noise. The flashlight sat on the nightstand. I picked it up, gripping it tightly. My heart pounded against my ribs. Another sound, this time the faintest rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. I crept to the window, peering out. Darkness. The trees stood tall, unmoving. The porch was empty. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Minutes passed. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it had been my imagination. Maybe an animal. I crawled back into bed, leaving the flashlight in my hand. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed too dark, but eventually exhaustion won. I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. A part of me almost laughed at myself. Of course, it had been nothing. Just my nerves, the unfamiliarity of the place. I shook off the lingering unease and went about my day. But that night, the sounds came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, not on the porch, but inside. Slow, careful steps moving across the floorboards. I lay frozen, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The sound moved closer, past the bedroom door. I held my breath. Then nothing. Minutes stretched. My ears rang in the silence. Then, just as I started to think I imagined it, the sound returned, footsteps, but this time moving away, towards the front door. Morning came and I searched the cabin. The door was still locked. The windows shut. No signs of forced entry. I checked outside, circling the cabin, looking for footprints. The ground was soft, but there were none. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. The noises didn't stop. The feeling of being watched, the heavy silence of the woods pressing in around me. I packed my things before the sun even rose and left without looking back. When I told Peter, he just frowned. Said he never experienced anything like that before. Said I must have let my imagination get to me. But I knew what I heard. And the worst part? When I checked my phone after leaving, I found a photo in my gallery. A single image taken inside the cabin. It was dark, grainy, but in the corner, just barely visible, was the outline of a person standing in the doorway. I had been alone, or at least I thought I had. The first time I heard about the cabin, I was 27. My uncle left it to me after he passed away, though I hadn't seen him in years. I didn't remember much about him except that he was quiet, a little strange, and lived alone in the woods. The cabin was deep in northern Minnesota, miles from the nearest town, in the kind of place where the roads turn to dirt and cell service disappears. I wasn't sure if I even wanted it, but curiosity got the best of me. So, on a chilly October morning, I packed my truck with a few days' worth of food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a pistol just in case. I had no idea what condition the cabin was in, but I figured I could at least check it out before deciding what to do with it. The drive took nearly 8 hours. By the time I reached the turnoff onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. The road was rough, barely more than a trail, with branches scratching against the sides of my truck. I had to slow to a crawl to avoid the deep ruts and fallen limbs. My headlights barely cut through the thickening fog rolling in from the lake nearby. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was relieved to see it was still standing. It was small, made of dark, weathered logs with a sagging front porch. The windows were intact, though dusty, and the door looked solid. There was a shed out back, half hidden by the trees. The whole place smelled like damp wood and fallen leaves. I stepped out of my truck, stretching my stiff legs, and grabbed my flashlight. The air was colder than I expected, and a heavy silence hung over the place. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves as I walked up to the porch. The key was in my pocket, attached to a rusted old keychain my uncle had left in a box of his things. It slid into the lock with a scrape, and the door groaned as I pushed it open. The inside smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The cabin was just one large room. Against the far wall was a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a rusted sink, and a wooden counter. A rickety table and 2 mismatched chairs sat in the center of the room. A single bed with a thin, moldy mattress was shoved against the other wall, under a narrow window. The floor was covered in dust, except for a few spots where something had disturbed it. Maybe mice. I set my bag down and did a quick walkthrough. The cabinets were mostly empty, aside from some old cans and a jar of something unidentifiable. The shed out back held a stack of firewood, an axe, and a few rusted tools. It was clear no one had lived here in a long time. By the time I got a fire going in the stove, it was fully dark outside. The only light came from the flames and my flashlight, which I set on the table. I ate a can of beans cold and washed it down with some water before rolling out my sleeping bag on the bed. I didn't expect to sleep well, but I tried anyway. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. Took me a second to realize why. I had heard something outside. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on leaves. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Maybe a deer, I told myself, or the wind. But when I glanced at the window, I saw that the trees were still. The night was completely still. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. My gun was in my bag, just a few feet away, but I didn't want to move too quickly. The footsteps stopped, right outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the glass was too dusty to see much. My fingers wrapped around the pistol's grip as I forced myself to stand. The floor creaked under my weight, and the sound outside stopped. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. Then, a single knock. Not loud, not urgent, just a slow, deliberate tap. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. Instead, I stood there, gun in hand, waiting. Another knock, then silence. I flicked off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might shake the walls. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30, nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to think I imagined it, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were moving away. Slow, measured steps retreating into the trees. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat in the dark, gun in my lap, listening, waiting. But whoever or whatever had been outside didn't come back. At first light, I threw my things into my bag, stomped out the fire, and got the hell out of there. As I stepped onto the porch, I glanced down and felt my stomach drop. There were footprints, human footprints, leading from the tree-line to my door. But there were no prints leading away. I didn't look back. I got in my truck and drove, not stopping until I hit the main road. I didn't call the police. What would I even tell them? That someone knocked on my door in the middle of the night? That I was scared? I never went back. I had the cabin torn down a month later, paid a crew to do it, and never asked for details. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. Some places aren't meant to be lived in.